In the last video, I mentioned that no matter how highly correlated two variables happen to be, that alone is insufficient to assert causality. However, as human beings, we tend to look for patterns. When we find strong patterns, we tend to believe that it is because of something causal happening. This extends to data analysts. They also have this bias, and you'll find yourself at times thinking that because two things are highly correlated, there must be something causal happening. The primary difference between a causal relationship and one that's simply correlational is that in the case when X causes Y to change, then if we change X, Y will change as a result, because it was caused by X. So it would allow us to have control over our environment. That allows us to take actions as managers, and so we like these cases. Today we are going to first see how to properly talk about correlations and then see examples of fun correlations for which producing a causal story is difficult. And hopefully that will reduce the bias of thinking that when something is highly correlated, it's necessarily causal. So if you want to have a good grade at the exam, the best way is to make sure that you don't use any causal language when you're talking about correlations. So, for instance, language that implies a causality would be, if I'm hungry, then I eat. Or sentences using the word causes. Lack of studying causes lower grades. When you use the word when I'm tired, I sleep. All the words like increases, reduces, and in general, any verb with an action. Something cures something, makes, boosts. All of these imply causality, and if you just have a correlation, you're not allowed to use them. Instead, try to use language that talks about association specifically. So, something is associated with something, like higher prices are associated with lower sales. Something is correlated with something. Something is linked to something. The official statistics terminology is associated with, or in the specific case of linear correlation, you can say is correlated with. So if you use these sentences, you're safe. So of course, the press is horrible at this. And that is because they really like to make sensational causal claims. Here are a few examples. So weight loss surgery extends lives. I checked the study, there is no way to claim causality here, it's just a correlational study. These 5 exercises boost brain health and improve memory, study finds. So of course the study didn't find that, they found that people who exercise have better brain health, but it's just correlational, there is no way to make a causal claim. Or finally, e-cigarettes cause more lung inflammation with more capitalized than normal cigarettes, study finds. Again, this is just correlational. There was no experiment ran, so we cannot claim causality. So the press found a way around this, and they still make causal claims, but use may or can or could. So no, they can say, we didn't say it was causal, we just say that it might be causal. Like this, you can make any claim you want and then deny any responsibility. I can say you might easily get an A without studying, and if a student comes complaining because they failed the course, I will just say, oh, I said you might, I didn't say that it would happen. So we can see this is absolutely not informative, and it's just phrased to induce people in believing in causality while being able to still deny any responsibility. So here are 2 examples. The first one says that UV dryers in nail salons may damage DNA, and the second one says that muscle strength may be as important as aerobic exercises. And you can see that within the text of the article, they use the proper language. They say that muscle strengthening activities were associated with a 20% lower risk of health issues. Sometimes what happens, and I know because it happened to me, is that they contact the scientist and they ask the scientist to check the article, and the scientists make sure that the body of the article has the correct language. But then at the last minute before publishing, they change the title and put it online. When you contact them and ask them why did you change the title, the writer will just say, oh, the editor thought it would be better that way. Since people tend to just read the headlines, they end up having the wrong impression and believe that there is a causal relationship. They don't know what was actually found. So this is a big issue. So sometimes, but this is rare and I had to really look for specific articles that are written like that, you can see that in the title they are actually using the proper language. So in the first one, they say that sleep disorders are associated with more parental stress. And you can note here that the writer is actually a doctor, so maybe that's why it was properly written. In the second article, they say that hearing aids are linked to lower instance of dementia. So this is also proper language. So when can you claim causality? There are a few cases where you can claim having evidence for causality. The first one is for carefully controlled random experiments. They need to meet a lot of standards to be valid. First, participants need to be randomly assigned to groups. For instance, if you want to test the effect of various level of discount coupons on sales, you can send coupons with a 5% discount, a 10% discount, and a 15% discount to different random groups, and they have to be randomly selected. Then you compare sales between the groups. Then you have to be careful about selection bias. For instance, if you want to measure the effect of giving a scholarship on the probability to complete a degree, even if you give offers with scholarship randomly, the students who take the scholarship might not be representative of the population. For instance, you might have more students in financial difficulty. They would forego an offer from another university, like UW-Madison, to go to the university where they got a scholarship just because they have a scholarship and they need it. However, these students are already in financial difficulty and might be disappointed that they didn't go to UW-Madison and had to go to another university. As a result, they might be more likely to drop out, so our sample would not be representative of the actual populations of students, and you cannot measure the causal effect with that, even though you ran an experiment with randomly selected groups. A third important point is to look at exclusion criterions. Whom did you keep in your sample and whom did you remove? An example of that was at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. A study claimed that hydroxychloroquine could help cure COVID. However, when you look at the study in detail, it excluded the patients that were moved to the intensive care units. And they say they removed them from the data because the outcome, death or survival, couldn't be tracked. That, of course, completely invalidates the conclusion of the study. There are other factors that might make a random controlled experiment valid or not, but we are not teaching them in this course. If you're interested, there are other courses that are specifically designed to experiment correctly. So if you're interested, go on and check these courses. Now, a second case where you can sometimes claim causality is with natural experiments. A natural experiment is an empirical or an observational study in which the control and the experimental variables are not artificially manipulated by researchers. For instance, you want to see the effect of weather on umbrella sales. It is very difficult for a researcher to manipulate the daily weather, but you can still argue that it is random, and so you can compare sales between sunny days and rainy days. There are other kind of events where you can argue that they are random with respect to the outcome, for instance, an earthquake or some cities introducing a sugary drinks tax, and so you can use them as if it was an experiment. Finally, there are causal inference methods, which we won't cover here, but you can study them in statistics and in economics, where it is very difficult to run experiments. Indeed, you cannot fire half of the labor force just to see what happens to the GDP. So they developed other kinds of methods to find out what the causal relationship is. So now let's move on to the fun examples. I just want to give my sources. The example we are going to see, they come from tylervegan.com. He has a book out, and you can see many more similar examples in that book. In our first example, we see that the total revenue generated by arcades each year is highly correlated with the number of computer science doctorates awarded in the US. What I want you to do is to take a moment and come up with a causal story for why an increase in the total revenue generated by arcades might cause an increase in the number of computer science doctorates awarded in the US. Or because we have only correlational data at our disposal here, you could also come up with a story about why an increase in the total number of computer science doctorates leads to greater revenue generated by arcades. Go ahead and pause the video and write down a potential causal story that would explain this high level of correlation. Now, I want to provide you with some examples that we got in previous years. A reason that an increase in the total number of computer science doctorates would increase the total revenue generated by arcades is that an increase in the number of doctorates suggests that more people are receiving more training in computer science. They may in turn create better video games, and those video games would then lead to greater revenues for arcades. In terms of reversing the causality, a reason that an increase in the total revenue generated by arcades may lead to an increase in the number of computer science doctorates is that arcades may take a portion of their profits, and because they know that video game designers play a big role in the quality of games, they may donate them to computer science programs. And then these computer science programs will use these funds to fund their computer science doctorate program, increasing the number of students that they can serve. In the end, you will have a higher number of computer science doctorates graduating. So we can get a causal story in either direction. We could also potentially think about an omitted variable, something that would cause both of these to increase at the same time, even if they are not necessarily related. In this case, it might be the increase that we've seen in computer processing speed and the corresponding decrease in computer processing cost that leads to these correlations. You can think that that may lead arcades getting greater revenues as they get better games because they have faster processors, better 3D graphics, or new VR games. It may also lead more people to be interested in studying graduate work in computer science because there is simply more computers can do. Now, all of these stories are equally supported by the correlational relationships that we are seeing in this plot. We cannot use this evidence alone to disentangle these explanations, so we don't know which one is real or if any of them is real. It could be that they are all wrong. Let's move on to our next example. Our next example might hit a little bit too close to home for some of us here in Wisconsin. That's because per capita cheese consumption is highly correlated with the number of people who die by becoming entangled in their own bed sheets. Again, I want you to stop the video and come up with a causal story to explain this relationship. It could either be that cheese consumption causes death, or that death causes cheese consumption. Here are stories we got in previous years. Well, it's possible that if you eat a lot of cheese, you get an upset stomach, and then turn in your sleep and become entangled in your bed sheets. That increases the risk of death. At the same time, why might death by bedsheet entanglement lead to greater per capita cheese consumption? Well, cheese is frequently served at receptions following funerals, so if more people die, more people will go to funerals and eat more cheese. That will increase cheese consumption. So we can come up with a causal story in either direction, and as soon as that causal story is suggested, it becomes much more believable. It doesn't make it true, it's just pure speculation. Of course, we could also think of an omitted variable here, what might cause both cheese consumption and death by bedsheet entanglement to increase at the same time, even if neither one of those are directly related. Well, in that case, we could think of an increase in wine consumption. Indeed, people like to pair cheese with wine, but if people drink more wine, they may also go to bed, pass out, and then turn in their sleep and become entangled and die. Again, this is just like the last example. This plot alone does not let us disentangle those stories or make any of them correct. We would need a lot more information to figure out if any of them is correct. I think that I've just shown you that you can come up with a causal story for almost any kind of relationship you can see in the data. That doesn't make the story true. A scatter plot or a strong correlation is not sufficient to determine if any of these stories is accurate. There are methods to obtain evidence of causal relationships, but we don't teach them in this course. One of them is carefully designed and controlled experiments, and there is a whole field dedicated to studying how to conduct experiments properly. There are also natural experiments, and finally there are causal inference methods. If you don't have any of these, then you cannot make a causal statement about the relationship in your data.